We have been studying Sri Aurobindo's commentary on the Brihadaranyaka Upanishad, of which the first few lines go thus: Om, dawn is the head of the horse sacrificial, the sun his eye, his breath is the wind, his wide open mouth is fire, the master might universal. Thus far we had studied, and then time is the self of the horse sacrificial. Heaven is his back and the mid-world his belly. Earth is his footing. In Sri Aurobindo's commentary, he goes to the etymological root of the words Ashva, Usha, and so on. And we see in the whole picture the deeper intuitive experience of a great universal force surging forward, of which the front, the leading edge, is Usha, which means coming into manifest being, desiring, yearning, on the brink of its satisfaction. And as this horse, Ashva, the power which is the manifesting energy, pervading with strength, force, speed and enjoyment, constituting the whole material universe, as this energy surges, Usha is the front. But then we saw last time, the sun is the eye of this great force, the wind is its life breath or vital energy, fire is its open mouth. And in our study, we found Sri Aurobindo describing the sun in the Vedic sense of the seeing vision which creates as it sees. The wind is the life breath or vital energy, and we saw last time the life force, prana, and the importance that it has in forming what is seen, energizing, and finally fire is its open mouth. And we read from Sri Aurobindo's observations and comments on the fire principle, on Agni as a Vedic deity, and the formative character of this principle, and the triple fire forming on three different levels, in its most subtlest, in an intermediate form, and then its most dense material, Jada, Agni. And we saw how the seeing eye of the sun, the life force which is breathed out by this horse, and the fire which is the open mouth are so deeply interconnected. So much so that we even found in our study they seem to merge into each other. There is as if a single movement which takes this poise of seeing, which takes the poise of the energizing life force, and then which takes the poise of the formative fire, which is the open mouth. And we see how profound this whole image is, and it's not a mere allegory. We also saw last time that fire is the open mouth, because it is not that there is a mouth from which a fire comes to form. It is this formative power which is the open mouth. And the mouth is open because this whole formative energy of Agni is active, forming the universe, manifesting. But there is a deeper suggestion. When does the horse have the mouth open? When it is eating. And you will recall in the Vedic description of the fire, Sri Aurobindo describes how fire eats, it enjoys, but it purifies as it eats and enjoys. And so we have this very important suggestion which comes just from the idea of the mouth being open, that this formative energy of Agni is eating up. As it eats, it enjoys and it purifies and creates new and more refined material out of what it eats. And so the whole creative movement of manifestation has as its frontal edge this eating movement of Agni, which creates forms, but not only creates, it also consumes them and refines them. And we have the sense of the whole evolutionary movement, bit by bit, out of dense matter, more refined matter, and more refined elements emerge. And the whole evolutionary sense of the Agni being the leader of the evolution is caught just in this idea, in the suggestion of the open mouth, but also the enjoyment of the eating. Later, in the same Upanishad, in section 2, verse 1, we find there is the description of the hunger, but hunger as death. I read Sri Aurobindo's translation. Formerly there was nothing here. This was concealed by death, by hunger, for it is hunger that is death. That created mind, and he said, let me have substance. And so you see in the overall rhythm of the Upanishads unfolding, each of these things are interconnected. And the fire here as the open mouth is also preparing us for this movement of hunger and consuming. But at the moment it is just fire, and there is also the sense of the enjoyment. And all of these are the Vedic symbols that Sri Aurobindo refers to. And then he moves on to the next section. By themselves, they are almost sufficient to reveal the meaning of the symbol, yet not altogether sufficient. For taken by themselves, they might mislead us into supposing the horse of the worlds to be an image of the material universe only, a figure for those movements of matter and in matter with which modern science is so exclusively preoccupied. But the next image delivers us from passing by this side gate into materialism. There is a tendency, he says, for the modern mind to always tend to read what is interesting for its present mold and to not go deep enough to what is intended. So this would have been a side gate for escape. But the next verse brings the correction. But the next image delivers us from passing by this side gate into materialism. Time in its period is the self of the horse sacrificial. In the Sanskrit, it is Samvatsara Atmascha. So time in its periods is how Sri Aurobindo translates Samvatsara. And the distinction is important, as he will tell us later. It is not time in its essence as an abstract experience, but time in its rhythms, in its periods. And this is described as the Atma, the self. So Sri Aurobindo elaborates now. If we accept for the word Atma a significance which is also common and is indeed used in the next chapter, if we understand by it, as I think we ought here to understand by it, substance or body, the expression in itself, remarkable, will become even more luminous and striking. Not matter then, but time, a mental circumstance, is the body of this force of the material universe, whose eye is the sun and his breath the wind. So this is a very important statement. It has three secondary ideas. First, that time is not an experience of the material universe. Now we may pause here and wonder, what do we mean by that? If we try to measure time, if we try to catch time, if we try to see or through the senses perceive time, we cannot. There is nothing in the material universe which can be said, this is time. The whole experience of time exists in a consciousness which is essentially mental. It is because our mind registers a series of experiences that in the mind we map out this sequence of experiences in a sense of unfolding which we feel, experience as time. But the whole experience is in the mind. We may ask, what happens when you see a river move? To the material experience purely in matter, the movement does not carry any sense of time. It is simply a shift, a change of form. But time, where we can see ahead, where we can go back, place an event between two events, is a mental experience. In the river, you cannot go back. You cannot anticipate what will be. You are where you are, and where you are changes at each moment. So you do not have the true sense of time there. You see change, but not time. So the first important idea which he brings here is time, a mental circumstance, is the body of this force of the material universe. So he's using time, Atma, a time as the Atma, he translates as body or substance, meaning essential substance. When we say my soul, we mean by that my essence. It is this essential substance of this horse of the universe which is time. But it is a mental circumstance. And this is the body of the force of the material universe, the force from which the material universe came. And straight away it suggests to us, once again what we have already seen in the sequence of the sun, the wind and the fire, that it is out of the mental consciousness that the material universe emerges as it is dynamized by the energy of life force. But the soul of the whole material universe is still the mental consciousness. This is translated in our common human experience by the fact that all that we experience through the senses, in the material body, in the interactions with matter generally, is always ultimately determined by the state of mind. If my mind is calm and clear, I see things in a certain way. If my mind is agitated, I see the same thing in a different way. If my mind is biased in one direction or in another, the same experience is interpreted differently. The entire registration of our material experience rests on the state of mind. And by extension, one could even say that the whole experience of the material universe takes place in our mind. This is what the Buddhist philosophy highlights particularly by saying the whole universe, finally, where do you experience it? Where do you know it? Even your senses, how do they exist? Where do you know the truth of what they see? In mind. And so the whole universe, they say, exists in your mind. And if you change your mind, the whole universe changes. This is true at an individual subjective level, but it is much more profoundly true at a cosmic level, where the cosmic mind is the formator of the material universe. And if the cosmic mind chooses to turn in a different direction, eventually that change ripples down all the way into the material form. In the human body, we find this truth obviously experienced when our mind fixes itself imprints an idea or an intention in our life energies, life instincts, and eventually even on the body instincts, we are able to reshape the biological behavior and habit of our body. Even the mind insistent can correct an illness, or on the other hand, it can cause an illness because of the persistence of its tendency. So he says, not matter then, but time, a mental circumstance, is the body of this force of the material universe, whose eye is the sun and his breath the wind. Are we then to infer that the seer denies the essential materiality of matter? Does he assert it to be, as Huxley admitted it to be, a state of consciousness? And Sri Aurobindo doesn't immediately answer. He says, we shall see. And the discussion will follow later. Meanwhile, it is evident already that this horse of the worlds is not an image merely of matter or material force, but as we had already supposed it to be, an image of the power which pervades and constitutes the material universe. This is the horse of the worlds. So still the question can be asked, do they deny the essential materiality of matter? And we will see later, they do not. As he will point out in the very next line where it says, earth is his footing. And there's a whole story around this comment on Huxley, as well as the earth is his footing, where we accept matter as a part of himself, his base. And the whole story revolves around Huxley having read Sri Aurobindo, quoting Sri Aurobindo from the Life Divine, and then somebody asking Sri Aurobindo of Huxley's comment, and then Sri Aurobindo elaborating on that, and all of that discussion ties in exactly to this text. So I will come to that shortly, but for now we will just continue further and then revert to this connection with Huxley. And it's significant because when Sri Aurobindo wrote this commentary, Huxley had not yet read Life Divine and not yet commented on that relevant passage. So it is almost as if prophetic observation when Sri Aurobindo says, he assert it to be, as Huxley admitted it to be, a state of consciousness. So it is, we see now this horse of the world is an image of the power which pervades and constitutes the material universe. We get also from this image about time the idea of it as an unknown power. For time, which is its self or body, is itself an unknown quantity. The reality which expresses itself to us through time, its body, but remains itself ungrasped, must be still what men have always felt it to be, the unknown God. So the suggestion here, by saying Atma, Samvatsara, the unfolding rhythms of time are Atma, the suggestion is that it is an unknown power. And unknown essentially goes back to the source, the Atman, the divine. And then we will come back to the discussion on time later, shortly in the next paragraph. But Sri Aurobindo takes the image a step further. In the images that immediately follow, we have the conception of space added to the conception of time. And both are brought together side by side as constituents of the being of the horse. So you will recall from the text, time is the self of the horse sacrificial, heaven is his back, and the midworld his belly, earth is his footing, the regions are his flanks, and the lesser regions their ribs, the seasons his members. So you have straight away time and space brought together. But particularly here, space by the three levels of the back, the belly, and then the footing. For the sky is the flesh of his body, the quarters his flanks, and the intermediate regions his ribs. The sky Nabhas, the ether above us, in which the stellar systems are placed. And the stellar systems themselves, concentrations of ether, are the bones which support the flesh, and of which life in this spatial infinity takes advantage in order more firmly to place and organize itself in matter. We'll come back to this text because it is profound, but we'll just continue the discussion. But side by side with this spatial image is that of the seasons, reminding us immediately and intentionally of the connections of time to space. So this is an important thing. Where in the human experience do we find space and time most connected? And it is in the rhythm of the seasons. Because as time unfolds, space and the whole experience of material space changes and goes through these, as they describe, 4 or 6, depending on the cultures, cycles. The seasons, determined for us by the movements of the sun and stars, are the flanks of the horse. And he stands upon the months and the fortnights, the lunar divisions. So without stating these in so many words, the Upanishad points to these deep cosmic connections. The moment you say seasons, who causes the seasons? The sun. And the moment you say the months, who causes the month cycle? It's the moon. And the sun and the moon are automatically pulled in as the symbols of the rhythm of time unfolding in space, but without needing to name them. And this is the nature of the suggestive nature of the Upanishad. It captures large chunks of reality just by choosing the right word in the right place. We'll come back to all these later again, but for now I want to complete this paragraph. Space, then, is the flesh constituting materially this body of time, which the sage attributes to his horse of the worlds. By movement in space, its periods are shaped and determined. Therefore, we return always to the full idea of the horse, not as an image of matter, but as a symbol of the unknown supra-material power in its supra-material reality, but of that power expressing itself in matter. Materially, we might almost say, pervading and constituting the universe. So we find now this deeper sense of this great power of Ashva to be itself supramaterial. It is not a material power. And yet it is not complete and it is not fully manifest until it takes this material form. Time is its body, yes, but samvatsara, not kala. Time in its periods, determined by movement in space, not time in its essentiality. So this is the time-space discussion, and then Sri Aurobindo now moves to the next line. Moreover, it is that power imaging itself in cosmos. It is the horse of the worlds. For we read, heaven is his back, the mid-region is its belly, earth its footing. Pajasyam, that's the word used for the footing. Earth is its footing. Pajasyam, the 4 feet upon which it stands. And by saying Pajasyam, which is the feet and the 4 feet for the horse, again there is a deep suggestion that the imprint in matter uses these 4 supports. So we will elaborate on that later. And of this triple description, heaven, mid-region and earth, Sri Aurobindo now gives us a quick picture. We must be careful not to confuse the ancient seers' conception of the universe with our modern conception. To us, nothing exists except this system of gross material worlds, Annamayam Jagat. This earth, this moon, this sun and its planets, these myriad suns and their systems. So this is the human, modern, materialist worldview. But to the Vedantic thinkers, the universe, the manifest Brahman, was a harmony of worlds within worlds. They beheld a space within our space, but linked with it. They were aware of a time connected with our time, but different from it. And now he describes three of them, three of these regions. This earth was Bhur, rising in soul into the air above the earth, the Antariksham. They thought they came into contact with other sevenfold earths, in which just as here matter is the predominant principle, so there nervous or vital energy is the main principle. Or else manas, still dependent on matter and vital energy. These earths they called Bhuvar. So we are familiar with these three words of Veda, Bhur, Bhuva, Swa. But Bhuvar has 7 earths where the vital energy is dominant. And rising beyond this atmosphere into the ethereal void, they believed themselves to be aware of other worlds which they called Swar or heaven, where again in its turn, mind, free, blithe, delivered from its struggle to impose itself in a world not its own, upon matter and nerve life, is the medium of existence and the governing force. So the mental regions, and he describes suggestively the interconnections of all three, to which we will have to return later. But now we complete this idea. If we keep in mind these ideas, we shall easily understand why the images are thus distributed in the sentence I have last quoted. Heaven is the back of the horse, because it is on mind that we rest. Mind that bears up the gods and Gandharvas, Titans and men. You will recall in the first verse of the Upanishad, it ends with the horse carrying on his back the gods, the Gandharvas, Titans and human beings. The mid-world is the belly because vital energy is that which hungers and devours, moves restlessly everywhere, seizing everything and turning it into food. Or else, because mind is the womb of all our higher consciousness here. Earth is the footing because matter, outward form, is the fundamental condition for the manifestation of life, mind, and all higher forces. On matter we rest and have our firm stand. Out of matter we rise to our fulfillment in spirit. Now this last sentence completes this linkage which I was waiting for, and this idea that matter is the base on which we stand, on which we rest. But from matter, we don't stay stuck there. We rise to our fulfillment in spirit, and yet we don't lose our base. So it is this range from the highest spirit to the lowest, densest matter, which is the totality of the range that has to be realized. And so we come back to the question Sri Aurobindo raised. Are we then to infer that the seer denies the essential materiality of matter? Does he assert it to be, as Huxley admitted it to be, a state of consciousness? And he said, then we shall see. And the answer is clear. No, the seer does not deny matter. Earth is his footing. But earth is incomplete unless the movement of the horse, the energy in the intermediate worlds, and then on the back the horse carries the human being, the titans, the Gandharvas, and the gods. Then only we have the completion of the fullness of the great horse and its movement to manifest. And from here now we go to a passage in the Life Divine where Sri Aurobindo quotes just these lines. And then later we will see a commentary on it in the letters. So here is the passage from the Life Divine in the chapter titled The Two Negations, chapter 2. And it is here Sri Aurobindo says, "It is necessary, therefore, that advancing knowledge should base herself on a clear, pure, and disciplined intellect." So we are seeing the mind and the necessity for its purity and clarity and discipline. "It is necessary too that she should correct her errors sometimes by a return to the restraint of sensible fact, the concrete realities of the physical world." So if we were just living in the mind, we could easily drift into some fantasy. But we have to, knowledge has to return to matter and here get the concrete reality and the restraint of fact. And then Sri Aurobindo comments, "The touch of earth is always reinvigorating to the son of earth," that is the human being, "even when he seeks a supra-physical knowledge." And so we find a profound spiritual truth here, that although we seek supra-physical knowledge and experience, if we drift off into it, we can easily lose our way in a whole range of subjective experiences. It is only when we are able to relate, bridge, and found that in matter, in earth, in the human body, that we have the foundation and solidity and stability of the experience. So the touch of earth is always reinvigorating to the son of earth. And it is for this reason that inevitably, when we have gone too far in some higher experience, eventually we are pulled back. The body tires and pulls back the consciousness, and we must go to sleep, to rest in physicality, to reinvigorate ourselves before we can climb again. And it is this reinvigoration in matter which he is referring to, because this also is the divine reality. And for us humans, because we are human beings in a material body, this is reinvigorating to come back to earth. But then he says, "It may even be said that the supra-physical can only be really mastered in its fullness. To its heights we can always reach when we keep our feet firmly on the earth. Earth is his footing," says the Upanishad, "whenever it images the self that manifests in the universe." This is the very interesting portion. He says, the supra-physical can be really mastered in its fullness when we keep our feet firmly on the earth. Now, what does it mean when we say in its fullness? And here's a parenthetical comment, to its heights we can always reach. The idea is you can go very high, but do you have the fullness? You have the height, but do you have the fullness? In order to have the fullness, you must be able to link all the way down, because this also is a part of that. So for the fullness, we must keep our feet on the earth as we reach the higher heights. And so there is a constant bridging of the two extremes. Earth is his footing, says the Upanishad, whenever it images the self that manifests in the universe. And this is exactly the horse of the worlds of the Brihadaranyaka Upanishad. It is the self moving as this gigantic power manifesting itself to become the whole universe, down to the most material. I don't read the rest of the paragraph. Maybe I should read. And it is certainly the fact that the wider we extend and the surer we make our knowledge of the physical world, the wider and surer becomes our foundation for the higher knowledge, even for the highest, even for the Brahma Vidya. To know truly the knowledge of Brahman, you must have equally a wide knowledge of the material, physical world. So there are two things here. To its heights we can always reach, Sri Aurobindo says. But we can get the fullness when we keep our feet firmly on the physical. And now from this we go to the letter in which this is all referred to. And this goes to page 126 of Letters on Yoga of the collected works. So the footnote to this letter says, these remarks were dictated by Sri Aurobindo apropos of the phrase, to its heights we can always reach, occurring in the following passage in the Life Divine, quoted and commented upon by Aldous Huxley in his book, The Perennial Philosophy. And then the quotation is given, which we had just read. And now to this, Sri Aurobindo comments, because someone asked Sri Aurobindo to comment on it. And Sri Aurobindo dictates this in the third person. So he doesn't say I, he says Sri Aurobindo says. Sri Aurobindo has no remarks to make on Huxley's comments, with which he is in entire agreement. But in the phrase, to its heights we can always reach, very obviously, we does not refer to humanity in general, but to those who have a sufficiently developed inner spiritual life. It is probable that Sri Aurobindo was thinking of his own experience. Now, Sri Aurobindo is too humble to say, I was thinking of my own experience. So he puts it in this way. But what is his experience? And this is the interesting thing. After 3 years of spiritual effort with only minor results, he was shown by a yogi the way to silence his mind. This he succeeded in doing entirely in 2 or 3 days by following the method shown. There was an entire silence of thought and feeling and all the ordinary movements of consciousness, except the perception and recognition of things around, without any accompanying concept or other reaction. The sense of ego disappeared, and the movements of the ordinary life, as well as speech and action, were carried on by some habitual activity of Prakriti alone, which was not felt as belonging to oneself. So this was Sri Aurobindo's experience. It is a nirvanic experience. But the perception which remained saw all things as utterly unreal. This sense of unreality was overwhelming and universal. Only some undefinable reality was perceived as true, which was beyond space and time, and unconnected with any cosmic activity, but yet was met wherever one turned. So there is this experience of a nirvanic experience where everything is a mechanical movement, unreal. Where is the reality? There is an underlying reality but beyond space and time, which is there everywhere but beyond space and time. This condition remained unimpaired for several months. And even when the sense of unreality disappeared, there was a return to participation in the world consciousness. The inner peace and freedom which resulted from this realization remained permanently behind all surface movements, and the essence of the realization itself was not lost. At the same time, an experience intervened. Something else than himself took up his dynamic activity and spoke and acted through him, but without any personal thought or initiative. What this was remained unknown until Sri Aurobindo came to realize the dynamic side of the Brahman, the Ishvara. and felt himself moved by that in all his sadhana and action. Now, all this is to describing his experience, but to explain what he means by to its heights we can always reach, but earth is his footing. So he continues now. These realizations and others which followed upon them, such as that of the self in all, and all in the self, and all as the self, the divine in all, and all in the divine, are the heights to which Sri Aurobindo refers, and to which he says we can always rise. Now, all of these experiences which he lists are the fundamental experiences which the Isha Upanishad points to, and Sri Aurobindo himself describes as the foundation to all spiritual realization. But all of this having attained, Sri Aurobindo says these are the heights which he was referring to which we can always rise. For they presented to him no long or obstinate difficulty. So if all this he got very easily, what was the difficulty? Where was the problem? And now he explains what was the problem. And it has to do with this earth is the footing. He says, the only real difficulty which took decades of spiritual effort to work out towards completeness was to apply the spiritual knowledge utterly to the world and to the surface psychological and outer life, and to effect its transformation both on the higher levels of nature and on the ordinary mental, vital and physical levels, down to the subconscious and the basic inconscious, and up to the supreme truth consciousness or supermind, in which alone the dynamic transformation could be entirely integral and absolute. So this is the end of the letter. So the difficulty was this: having attained all this, how does one link it to the world and to the surface psychological and outer life? That means in the most material part of our human surface experience, it has to be linked, and that truth which is there, experienced, constantly present, to be applied to transform all of this. And transforming from higher nature to lower nature all the way to inconscience and up to the truth consciousness of the supermind, in which alone the dynamic transformation could be entirely integral and absolute. Any other transformation on intermediate levels could not be absolute until it was linked all the way to the highest supramental. But on the other hand, that higher regions realized was not complete until it had been brought down, manifested, to transform all of the outer levels down to the most material. And it is this completeness which is the difficult part of the struggle which he had to work on. And he says it took him decades of spiritual effort to work out towards completeness. One could, of course, work out in a provisional way, which was easily done. One could work out even on a practical level where most of life now is dominated by the spiritual truth. But to work out completely down to the lower levels of nature, down to the physical, to the subconscious and the basic inconscious, that was the most difficult and took decades of spiritual effort. Now we'll take this letter and the phrase, to the heights we can always reach, link it with the text of the Life Divine, where he says, to the heights we can always reach, but we can have really mastered in fullness the supraphysical only when we keep our feet firmly on the earth, on the physical. Earth is his footing, says the Upanishad, whenever it images the self that manifests in the universe. So when we say earth is his footing, that is, he himself, the divine himself, has his feet on the earth, or the earth is his feet. And you do not know him entirely unless you know earth and his feet including. And so we come from this back to the text where he speaks of Huxley. Does the Rishi assert it to be, as Huxley admitted it to be, a state of consciousness? That is, does the seer deny the essential materiality of matter? And the answer is no, because earth is his footing. Sri Aurobindo quotes for this earth is his footing 2 texts from Mundaka Upanishad, which says Padbhyam Prithivi, that is, the feet are the earth, or the feet are on the earth. And from the Brihadaranyaka Upanishad, Prithivi Pajasyam, which is the text that we are reading, where the 4 feet of the horse are the earth. But the horse, with its feet as the earth, when he gallops, it is by action in matter that he moves. The movement of the horse is not the movement in the upper regions or in the mid regions. It is the movement on the earth. So when we speak of the divine manifesting and unfolding his infinite possibilities, the unfoldment has to rest on the earth, and it is by changing in the densest material form that the full movement surges forward. On the other hand, what animates the feet of the horse? The muscles, the energies which belong to the intermediate regions, life force. It is life force which dynamizes the material movement. And if we go still further, who guides those energies? Who directs the movements of the muscles? Who directs where the horse goes? We could say the head, but actually it's the rider seated on the back of the horse, the mind. It is the mind which determines where it wishes to go, and the mind guides the directions of the energies. Otherwise the energies may continue moving mechanically, as we saw in the description of the nirvanic experience. The consciousness can stand back and the mechanical galloping goes on. And it's not me, it is unreal. Or it can surge in and direct the energies, seize them and express through them itself. And the energies themselves finally rest on the footing, the solid base of the material form. So when we reread the passage from Sri Aurobindo's commentary, he says, on matter we rest and have our firm stand. Out of matter we rise to our fulfillment in spirit. And in the next paragraph, he says, then once again, after these higher and more remote suggestions, we are reminded that it is some force manifesting in matter which the horse symbolizes. The material manifestation constitutes the essence of its symbolism. The whole horse of the worlds is not horse of the worlds unless the symbol goes all the way to the material manifestation. He now comments on some of the rest of the images. Some of them are at the same time of a striking interest to the practical student of yoga, for he recognizes in them allusions to certain obscure but exceedingly common yogic phenomena. The strands of the rivers are imaged as the undigested food in the horse's belly, earth not yet assimilated or of sufficient consistency for the habitual works of life. The rivers distributing the waters, that is the lifeblood of earth's activities, are his veins. The mountains breathing in health for us, and from the rarer altitudes and supporting by the streams born from them, the works of life, are his lungs and liver. Herbs and plants springing up out of the sap of earth are the hairs covering and clothing his body. All that is clear enough and designedly superficial. But then the Upanishad goes on to speak no longer of superficial circumstances, but of the powers of the horse. And then he speaks of the lightning and the thunder, etc. But all that we will study later. Now we come back to the two paragraphs which we rapidly went through, and we'll now take them up for a deeper study. We have seen the time as the self of the horse, but time as it moves towards space. And then the space, the directions, are again associated with the form of the horse, the sides particularly. And then the three levels of the three worlds are the three levels of the horse. At this point, we will pause. We will return to the detailed study of these two paragraphs next time when we meet. But at this point, we will pause and look at the big picture of the horse. We see now one gigantic energy which is surging forward, the speed of the horse's movement, the energy and strength of the horse. And if you let the sense of Ashwa go fully, the enjoyment, the horse runs with abandon in its full freedom. It can go where it likes and it enjoys that energy, the speed and power of its movement. And of this surging energy, the frontal part is Usha, dawn. Dawn, which is this yearning, desiring impulse to manifest, on the brink of manifestation. And then from that brink of manifestation, how does she manifest? The sun is the eye that sees, and what it sees becomes. The life breath fills what is seen, and the fire as the open mouth is completing the dense material form that emerges, the energy directed, cast into form, given shape. And you will recall from our discussion last time the 5 elements from the ether, the air, the fire, water, earth. And you see this sequence in the formation. And this open mouth devouring, enjoying as it devours, but forming, emerging, and at the same time evolving. Later, we will link this frontal part with the hind of the horse, where the back and the hind portion is where the waste is thrown out. What is devoured here and new created, cast into new form, leaves behind something which is no more relevant, some waste which no more belongs to the unfolding evolution. That dies away, rots, fades, and moves into the back, into the past, into the inconscience, into the darkness, into the unmanifest. So you will see in the image of the horse, it is described as the rising is his front and the setting his hinder portion. Because all that is to unfold, has to be lit up, is in the front. All that now fades away back into the unmanifest is the setting behind him. And so this mouth, the fire, forming, casting into form, purifying, but also the mouth takes in, digests, becomes the body of the horse, but the waste is withdrawn gradually and subsides into the unmanifest. When we look at the past of the universe, where is that past? It is gone somewhere. We cannot find it anywhere. If you observe any form, it emerges out of either nothingness, an empty space, or some other form. It emerges and then subsides eventually, lapses back into the nothingness, into emptiness, into the past. So this front is the edge pushing forward. But in this whole movement, which is still seen as a gigantic cosmic movement, not yet the details formed, the self is time. And it is on this essentiality of time the self exists in the mental experience. And it is from here that everything else is determined. And space and time are brought together side by side as constituents of the being of the horse. For the sky is the flesh of his body, the quarters his flanks, and the intermediate regions his ribs. So this is the picture that we will hold as we pause to meditate, and we will continue this text after a gap of about 4 weeks in April from the 12th, which is a Sunday. In between, on each of the Sundays, we will continue to show some videos of some talks which would be of general interest. For now, we can read the fullness of verse 1 and meditate on the completeness of this picture. Om Ushava Ashvasya Medhyasya Shirah Suryashchakshur Vatah Prano Vyattam Agnir Vaishvanara Samvatsara Atmascha Ashvasya Medhyasya. Om. Dawn is the head of the horse sacrificial. The sun is his eye. His breath is the wind. His wide open mouth is fire, the master might universal. Time is the self of the horse sacrificial. Heaven is his back, and the midworld his belly. Earth is his footing. The regions are his flanks, and the lesser regions their ribs. The seasons his members. The months and the half months are their joints. The days and nights are his standing place. The stars his bones, and the sky is the flesh of his body. The strands are the food in his belly. The rivers are his veins. His liver and his lungs are the mountains. Herbs and plants are his hairs. The rising is his front, and the setting his hinder portion. When he stretches himself, then it lightens. When he shakes his frame, then it thunders. When he urines, then it rains. Speech, verily, is the sound of him. Day was the grandeur that was born before the horse as he galloped. The eastern ocean gave it birth. Night was the grandeur that was born behind him, and its birth was from the other waters. These are the grandeurs that came into being on either side of the horse. He became higher and bore the gods. Vaja and bore the Gandharvas. Arvan and bore the Titans. Ashva and bore mankind. The sea was his brother, and the sea was his birthplace.